In the shivering darkness of January 14, 1943, the North Atlantic was no longer an ocean. It had become a graveyard of steel, a churning abyss where the life expectancy of a merchant sailor was measured not in years or months, but in the terrifying minutes it took for a freezing lung to stop searching for air. At the center of this frozen hell was the HMS Thistle. To the Royal Navy, she was an embarrassment, a repurposed coal-burning trawler that had been dragged out of a fishing harbor and fitted with a single 4-inch gun that looked more like a decorative antique than a weapon of war. At 38 years old, Commander Julian Vane stood on her bridge, his face etched with the salt and exhaustion of 3 weeks without real sleep. He was a man who understood better than anyone that he was commanding a floating relic in an age of predatory technology. Around him, the Black Pit, the mid-Atlantic gap beyond the reach of Allied air cover, yawned wide. And somewhere beneath the black, white-capped waves, the gray wolves were hunting. The German U-boat wolf packs were not just a threat, they were a mathematical certainty. By 1943, Admiral Donitz's submariners had refined the art of the slaughter into a science of acoustics and geometry. They didn't just fire torpedoes, they orchestrated tragedies. For the men aboard the Thistle, the odds were not merely against them, they were non-existent. The Admiralty's standing orders were cold, clear, and dictated by the brutal arithmetic of total war. Any vessel that sustained critical damage, any ship that could no longer maintain the convoy's pace, was to be scuttled immediately. There was no room for sentiment, no time for salvage, and certainly no resources for a slow-moving target. You sank your ship, you boarded an escort if there was room, and you watched your command vanish into the depths to prevent the enemy from claiming even a scrap of British iron. It was a policy of survival through sacrifice, but to Julian Vane, it felt like a betrayal of the very soul of seamanship. If you want to understand how a man's refusal to follow a death sentence changed the course of a naval campaign, make sure to listen closely to what happened when the water finally broke. The Thistle was never meant to be a hero. She was slow, her top speed barely touching 10 knots on a good day with a following wind. Her hull was thin, her engines groaned with every revolution, and her crew was a ragtag collection of reservists and men deemed too old or too green for the sleek new destroyers. They called her the Rusty Bucket, a nickname earned through the constant battle against the corrosive salt that ate at her plates. But Vane saw something else. He saw a ship that refused to die, a vessel that had survived 30 years of North Sea gales before the war even started. He knew every vibration of her deck, every hiss of the steam pipes. To the High Command in London, she was a disposable asset, a piece of bait intended to distract a U-boat long enough for a valuable tanker to escape. To Vane, she was a home, and more importantly, she was a tool that hadn't been used to its full potential yet. The atmosphere in the North Atlantic that winter was a physical weight. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed through the rigging, coating every surface in a thick, treacherous layer of ice that could capsize a small ship by weight alone. Men worked in shifts just to chip away at the frozen sea, knowing that if the ice grew too thick, the Thistle would simply roll over and vanish. In the distance, the silhouettes of the convoy flickered like ghosts against the horizon. Heavy tankers laden with high-octane fuel, freighters packed with grain and ammunition, all of them the lifeblood of a Britain that was starving and freezing. The Thistle sat on the perimeter, a tiny soot-stained guardian, watching for the wake of a torpedo that everyone knew was coming. At precisely 1942 hours, the reality of the war caught up with the HMS Thistle. There was no warning. The G7E electric torpedo, a weapon designed for stealth, left no trail of bubbles. It traveled through the freezing depths like a silent predator, its magnetic detonator sensing the mass of the Thistle's iron hull. When it struck, it didn't hit the center of the ship. It slammed into the stern, right where the propeller shaft met the hull. The explosion was not a sharp crack, but a deep, resonant boom that vibrated through the marrow of every man on board. The stern of the Thistle didn't just bend, it disintegrated. Thousands of tons of seawater rushed into the engine room in a violent, icy torrent. The ship bucked like a wounded animal, throwing men across the bridge and plunging the entire vessel into a terrifying flickering darkness as the generators failed. In the sudden silence that followed the blast, the only sound was the haunting groan of twisting metal and the frantic shouts of men in the dark. The Thistle began to settle, her aft sinking rapidly, her bow tilting toward the sky at a sickening angle. On the horizon, the lead escort, the destroyer HMS Bulldog, signaled via a blinking Aldous lamp. The message was brief and brutal. "Assess damage. Prepare to scuttle. We cannot stop." This was the moment of the inciting incident, the heartbeat where history should have followed the script written in the Admiralty manuals. The Bulldog's captain was already calculating the depth charges he would use to send the Thistle to the bottom. He was already preparing to pull Vane and his survivors from the water, provided the U-boats didn't strike again during the rescue. According to every rule of naval engagement, the Thistle was a dead ship. Her propulsion was gone, her steering was destroyed, and she was taking on water faster than her pumps could ever hope to manage. But Julian Vane didn't give the order to abandon ship. He stood on the slanting bridge, holding onto a railing for support, and looked at his men. He saw the fear in their eyes, the expectation of a cold grave. But he also saw the engineers, men who had spent their lives fixing things that were broken beyond repair. Vane knew that if they abandoned the Thistle now, they weren't just losing a ship, they were losing a platform that the enemy already considered a non-threat. He looked at the gaping hole in his ship's stern and saw not a wound, but an opportunity. "Tell the Bulldog we are staying," Vane commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos. The signalman hesitated, his hands trembling over the lamp. "Sir, the order is to scuttle. We're a sitting duck." Vane turned to him, his eyes like flint. "Tell them we are not a ship anymore. Tell them we are a stationary fortification. We are staying with the Thistle." The response from the Bulldog was one of utter disbelief. To the commander of the escort group, Vane's decision wasn't just brave, it was delusional. It was a breach of protocol that risked the lives of his crew for a pile of scrap metal. In the eyes of the Royal Navy, Julian Vane had just committed professional suicide. He was a rogue officer refusing a direct order in the middle of a combat zone. But as the convoy pulled away, leaving the broken, listing Thistle alone in the dark, Vane began to implement a plan that no engineering manual would ever dare to print. He knew that the U-boats were still out there, watching, waiting for the easy kill. He knew they would see a sinking wreck and move on to the bigger prizes. And it was in that assumption, the enemy's belief in the Thistle's death, that Vane found his only weapon. He was about to turn his floating coffin into the most sophisticated decoy in the history of the North Atlantic, using nothing but grit, wet concrete, and a refusal to accept defeat. The Thistle was down, but as the first rhythmic clank of an engineer's hammer echoed through the flooded hull, it was clear that she was far from out. The silence that followed the departure of the convoy was heavier than the roar of the explosion. As the rhythmic thrum of the Bulldog's engines faded into the mist, the men of the HMS Thistle were left with the terrifying realization that they were now the only living things in a desert of black water. The temperature had plummeted to 4 degrees below zero, and the wind was whipping the sea into jagged peaks that threatened to swamp the listing deck at any moment. To any observer, the Thistle was a corpse. Her stern was a jagged, twisted ruin of iron. Her propeller was somewhere on the seabed 3 miles below, and her rudder had been sheared off like a piece of brittle parchment. The ship was taking on over 50 tons of water an hour, and the primary pumps were choked with coal dust and debris. Chief Engineer Arthur Miller, a man who had spent 30 years in the damp heat of boiler rooms, climbed onto the bridge, his face smeared with grease and salt. He didn't offer a salute. Instead, he handed Commander Vane a piece of twisted copper tubing. It was a fragment of the main cooling line, crushed beyond recognition. Miller's voice was a rasping whisper. "The aft compartments are completely breached, sir. We've lost the steering flat, the shaft alley, and everything behind the engine room bulkhead. If we don't seal it, the weight of the water will snap the hull in two within the hour." Vane looked at the metal in his hand, and then out at the horizon where his countrymen had disappeared. He knew the Admiralty was already marking the Thistle as lost in action. He knew that in London, clerks were preparing the paperwork to notify the families. But Vane wasn't looking for a way to die. He was looking for a way to change the geometry of the fight. The Thistle's cargo hold was not empty. She had been tasked with carrying emergency supplies for the rail networks in North Africa, specifically 84 lengths of industrial-grade steel railway tracks and 20 tons of quick-setting hydraulic concrete meant for harbor repairs. To a naval architect, this was just ballast. To Vane, it was a skeleton and skin. He ordered the remaining able-bodied men into the hold. "We aren't going to pump the water out," Vane told his officers. "We're going to give the water a place to live, and then we're going to build a wall it cannot cross." The engineering feat that followed was a descent into a mechanical purgatory. In the waist-deep freezing water of the flooded stern, Miller and his team began the forbidden repair. They used the heavy railway tracks as improvised structural ribs, welding them directly to the remaining frames of the ship's hull. The heat from the welding torches created a thick, choking fog in the cramped spaces, but the men worked with the frantic energy of the condemned. They created a massive, crisscrossing cage of steel over the gaping wound in the stern. Then, they began the most desperate part of the gamble. They mixed the industrial concrete with seawater and poured it directly into the cage, creating a solid, 10-foot-thick plug of reinforced stone. This was a violation of every principle of naval stability. A ship is supposed to be flexible, to move with the stresses of the ocean. By adding a massive, rigid block of concrete to the stern, Vane was essentially turning the Thistle into a lopsided anchor. The ship now sat 4 feet lower in the water than she was ever designed to, and she developed a permanent, sickening list of 12 degrees to the starboard side. Every time a wave hit, the hull groaned with a sound like a giant's teeth grinding together. The men slept on the slanting floors, their bodies bruised from the constant struggle to stay upright. In the quiet moments of the night, Vane would sit in his cabin, staring at the charts. He could feel the resentment of his crew through the very bulkheads. They were tired, they were cold, and they believed their captain had lost his mind. Internal monologues of doubt plagued him. Was he a hero, or was he simply a man who couldn't admit he'd been beaten? He thought of his wife in Portsmouth, of the garden he might never see again, and the weight of the lives he was gambling felt heavier than the concrete in the hold. If he had scuttled the ship, his men would be safe on a destroyer, warm and fed. Instead, they were clinging to a floating scrap heap in the middle of a war zone. But Vane also knew the secret of the Black Pit. He knew that the German U-boats relied on the visual confirmation of a kill. They were low on torpedoes, and they didn't waste them on wrecks. The worst decision was starting to take on a strange tactical shape. By intentionally flooding the forward port compartments to counteract the weight of the concrete, Vane managed to stabilize the ship at a grotesque, deceptive angle. From a distance, especially through the salt-sprayed lens of a periscope, the Thistle looked like a vessel in the final stages of foundering. She was low, she was tilted, and she showed no signs of life. Vane ordered all lights extinguished and all unnecessary noise silenced. He even had the crew drape oil-soaked tarpaulins over the remaining guns. They became a ghost ship, a piece of flotsam that the German radar and sonar operators would dismiss as a derelict. But the isolation was not absolute. The Thistle's radio, powered by a sputtering emergency generator, was still capable of receiving. On the third day of their lonely drift, the radio operator, a 19-year-old named Simon, brought Vane a decrypted intercept. It wasn't meant for them. It was a high-priority broadcast from the Admiralty to all escort groups. The Empress of Indias, a former luxury liner now serving as a primary troop transport, had been forced to break away from its own escort due to a boiler failure. She was currently steaming at reduced speed, carrying over 4,000 soldiers of the 1st Division, and her path was taking her directly through the sector where the Thistle was currently drifting. Vane felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The Empress of Indias was a massive target, a high-value asset that every U-boat commander in the Atlantic would sell his soul to sink. And he knew something the Admiralty didn't. His radio operator had been tracking a series of short-burst transmissions from the German wolf pack Hecht. The U-boats weren't just patrolling, they were congregating. They had found the Empress, and they were setting up a killing zone. This was the turning point. Vane looked at his broken ship, at the concrete-plugged stern and the improvised steel ribs. He looked at his crew, men who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. He could have stayed silent. He could have continued to drift, invisible and safe in his ghost ship disguise, until a passing patrol eventually found them. But that wasn't why he had refused to scuttle the Thistle. He hadn't stayed behind to save a ship. He had stayed behind because he believed that a sailor's duty didn't end when the manual said the ship was dead. "Miller," Vane called down to the engine room, "how much pressure can those boilers take?" The voice that came back was weary but sharp. "She's a tea kettle, sir. If we push her, the seams will pop. I need 5 knots, Vane said, his voice echoing in the metallic void. "I don't care if we burn the furniture. I need to move this mountain of concrete." As the Thistle began to sluggishly claw her way through the water, a strange phenomenon was discovered by the electrical team. The massive amount of industrial iron, the railway tracks, combined with the ship's remaining electrical systems and the friction of the concrete against the hull, was creating a massive, unintended electromagnetic field. The ship's compasses were spinning wildly, and the radio equipment was humming with static. Vane realized that they weren't just a physical decoy anymore. They were an electromagnetic anomaly. In an era where the Germans were beginning to deploy the G7E's Zaunkönig, acoustic torpedoes, and magnetic influence mines, the Thistle had inadvertently become a giant, floating magnet. Vane watched the radar screen as a large blip appeared, the Empress of Indias. Behind her, several smaller, faster blips were closing in. The wolf pack was moving in for the kill. The Thistle was positioned perfectly between the predator and the prey. Vane knew that his ship couldn't outrun a torpedo, and she certainly couldn't outfight a U-boat. But he also knew that the Germans would see a sinking wreck and assume it was a harmless casualty of the previous night's battle. He was going to use his worst decision to play a game of lethal misdirection, placing his concrete-armored hull directly in the path of the German steel, banking on the hope that the enemy would trust their instruments more than their eyes. The Thistle, the ship that was supposed to be at the bottom of the ocean, was about to become the only shield 4,000 men had left. At 03:14 on the morning of January 17, 1943, the mechanical soul of the HMS Thistle began to scream. In the engine room, Chief Miller was presiding over a symphony of impending disaster. The boiler pressure, which should have been capped at 160 pounds per square inch to ensure the safety of the aging rivets, had been forced up to a staggering 215. The pipes were vibrating with such violence that the scale was shaking loose from the interior walls, clattering like hailstones inside the metal. Every 5 minutes, a new leak would spring, a jet of superheated steam hissing into the cramped, dark space. The men worked with rags wrapped around their hands, frantically tightening valves while the ship pitched and rolled in a sea that had turned truly mountainous. The new obstacle wasn't just the water or the ice. It was the very physics of what Julian Vane had created. By adding nearly 40 tons of railway steel and concrete to the stern, he had fundamentally altered the ship's center of gravity and its displacement. The Thistle was now a hydrodynamic nightmare. Every time she dove into a trough between the waves, the reinforced stern acted like a massive, blunt hammer, slamming into the swell with enough force to shatter the teeth of the men on watch. The hull was flexing in ways it was never meant to, and the sound of the metal groaning against the rigid concrete plug was a constant, haunting reminder that they were sailing in a vessel that was technically tearing itself apart. Worse still was the unintended consequence of the magnetic shroud. The 84 lengths of industrial railway track, salvaged from the hold and welded into a makeshift skeletal cage, had turned the Thistle into a massive, accidental electromagnet. The ship's compasses were now entirely useless, their needles spinning in frantic, aimless circles. The radio equipment was plagued by a low-frequency hum that made communication with the outside world impossible. They were blind, deaf, and sailing a ship that was more a geological formation than a naval vessel. And yet, Vane pushed them forward. He knew the Empress of Indias was less than 15 miles away, a lumbering giant carrying the weight of 4,000 families on its decks, unknowingly steaming toward a concentrated pack of German steel. On the bridge, the cold was so intense that Vane's breath froze in his beard. He could feel the eyes of his junior officers on him, Lieutenant Holloway, barely 21, and the navigator, a man named Sterling who had lost his previous ship to a mine. There was no conversation. The air was thick with the unsaid. Vane's internal monologue was a relentless cycle of self-interrogation. He saw the faces of the men he had ordered to stay. If they died tonight, it wouldn't be a glorious sacrifice in the heat of battle. It would be a slow, freezing drowning in a ship that the world had already forgotten. He felt like a ghost, commanding a crew of shadows. He wondered if this was the madness of the deep that old sailors spoke of, the moment when a commander stops seeing reality and starts seeing only the mission. He was gambling 46 lives to save 4,000, but in the dark of the North Atlantic, the math of morality felt thin and brittle. "Sir," Sterling whispered, his voice cracking. "Hydrophone effect. Multiple contacts. Sector 40. The sound man, pressed against his equipment, nodded frantically. The Thistle's own engines were so loud that hearing anything else was nearly impossible, but the distinctive rhythmic pulse of high-speed propellers was unmistakable. The wolf pack was here. Vane looked at the radar, a primitive, flickering screen that was barely functional due to the electromagnetic interference. 2 large blips, the Empress of Indias and her lone, struggling escort, and surrounding them, 5 smaller, sharper echoes. The U-boats were moving into the overtaking position, preparing to surface and use their deck guns or to fire a spread of torpedoes from the flank. The Thistle was positioned about 2 miles ahead of the Empress, a drifting, lopsided wreck in the path of the predators. The turning point came at 0422. The lead German submarine, U-604, commanded by Kapitän Lieutenant Hans Meyer, spotted the Thistle through his periscope. In his logbooks, later recovered by historians, Meyer described the site as ein Gespensterschiff, a ghost ship. He saw a vessel that was clearly destroyed, listing heavily, its stern seemingly missing, and its decks awash with freezing spray. To Meyer, this was a confirmed kill from a previous engagement, a derelict left behind to sink. But as he prepared to bypass the wreck to line up a shot on the massive Empress of Indias, something went wrong with his instruments. The G7E torpedoes carried by U-604 were equipped with the PI-2 magnetic influence pistol. These were sophisticated detonators designed to sense the magnetic field of a large ship and explode directly beneath the keel, breaking the vessel's back with a single blow. As the U-604 drew closer to the wreck of the Thistle, the massive concentration of railway iron began to play havoc with the torpedo's sensors. The magnetic field was so concentrated and distorted that the torpedo's internal gyros and detonators began to pre-arm. Meyer, frustrated by the strange readings on his attack computer, decided to clear the rubbish from his path. He didn't want a derelict potentially drifting into his line of fire while he targeted the troopship. He ordered a single torpedo tube to fire. "Tube 1, lose!" The torpedo leaped from the U-boat, a streak of lethal intent cutting through the water at 30 knots. On the bridge of the Thistle, Vane saw the wake. He didn't order a turn. He couldn't. The ship didn't have a rudder. Instead, he gripped the railing and waited. "Brace for impact," he roared through the voice pipe. In those few seconds, time slowed to a crawl. Vane thought of the concrete. He thought of the railway tracks. He thought of the sheer absurdity of his situation. He was about to be hit by a weapon designed to sink a battleship, and he was standing on a pile of salvaged construction materials. The torpedo didn't strike the center of the ship. The magnetic pull of the iron tracks in the stern drew the weapon toward the very place Vane had reinforced. The torpedo's magnetic sensor saw the massive iron cage and decided that this was the center of the target. It veered sharply at the last second, slamming directly into the 10-foot-thick plug of hydraulic concrete. The explosion was catastrophic, but not in the way the Germans expected. The concrete didn't shatter, it absorbed. The force of the blast was dissipated throughout the rigid mass of the stone and the steel cage. A massive geyser of white water and black soot erupted into the air, obscuring the Thistle from view. Inside the ship, men were thrown like ragdolls. The lights went out. The hull groaned as if the earth itself were cracking open, but the Thistle didn't sink. The concrete plug, now cracked and scarred, remained wedged into the stern. The wall had held. For Captain Lieutenant Meyer, the sight was impossible. Through the spray, he saw the wreck still floating. More than that, he saw the wreck begin to flash its own signal light. Vane had ordered the signalman to fire the Aldi's lamp directly at the U-boat's position. A defiant, blinding glare in the dark. The German commander was suddenly gripped by a primal confusion. His instruments were haywire. His torpedo had seemingly failed to sink a stationary target, and the ghost was looking back at him. He assumed the Thistle was some new kind of Allied trap, a Q-ship, or a floating magnetic mine laboratory. He hesitated. He signaled the other boats in the pack to hold their fire. That hesitation, that moment of tactical doubt, was the gap the Empress of Indias needed. But the Thistle was now in a state of total mechanical collapse. The blast had severed the remaining steam lines. The engine room was filling with blinding vapor. Chief Miller was down, his arm broken, and the ship was beginning to settle even deeper into the water. Vane knew the Germans would recover from their shock in minutes. He had one card left to play, a gamble that would either save the Empress or ensure the Thistle became a permanent part of the Atlantic floor. He looked at Sterling and said the words that would define his legacy. "Open the remaining forward valves. We're going to dive without a submarine." At 04:38, on the morning of January 17, 1943, the HMS Thistle ceased to be a ship and became a localized environmental catastrophe. Commander Julian Vane's order to open the Kingston valves was the final desperate stroke of a man who had already abandoned the laws of naval architecture. By allowing the forward compartments to flood intentionally, Vane was performing a delicate, lethal balancing act. He was using the weight of the Atlantic to pull his bow down, matching the sagging weight of the concrete-plugged stern. The result was a vessel that sat so low in the churning water that the waves were now washing over the main deck. To the German observers in the Wolfpack, the Thistle had finally surrendered to the abyss. She was a dead ship, a sinking obstacle that would be gone in minutes. But beneath the freezing surface, the Thistle was screaming with magnetic energy. The 84 lengths of industrial railway track, now almost entirely submerged, were interacting with the ship's massive damaged generators and the salt-heavy water. They had created a massive electromagnetic bloom. To the sophisticated magnetic influence pistols of the German G7E torpedoes, the Thistle didn't look like a small trawler. She looked like the largest concentration of iron in the North Atlantic. She had become a magnetic siren, singing a song of false mass that the German technology was never designed to ignore. The Empress of Indias was now less than 3 miles away. From the bridge of the Thistle, Vane could see the massive silhouette of the troopship, a black mountain of steel moving through the mist. He knew that 4,000 men were sleeping in her cramped berths, unaware that they were steaming directly into a concentrated killing zone. He also saw the Hecht Wolfpack repositioning. Captain Lieutenant Meyer on U-604 was no longer looking at the Thistle. He had turned his attention to the great prize. He ordered a full spread of 4 torpedoes, aimed with lethal precision at the troopship's midsection. "They fired," Sterling whispered, his eyes glued to the hydrophone display. The 4 torpedoes streaked through the water, their magnetic sensors active and hungry. But as they entered the influence zone, created by the Thistle's improvised iron skeleton, the physics of the engagement shifted. The torpedoes, designed to seek the strongest magnetic signature, began to deviate from their path toward the Empress. The distorted field created by the railway tracks and the concrete plug acted like a gravitational well. One by one, the German weapons veered away from the troopship. 2 of them collided in the turbulent wake of a wave, exploding harmlessly in a massive, distant geyser of white foam. The third passed so close to the Thistle's submerged bow that the crew felt the vibration of its propellers through the hull. The fourth, however, was pulled directly into the Thistle's reinforced stern. The explosion was smaller than the first, a muffled thud beneath the waterline, but it was enough to shatter the remaining glass on the bridge. The concrete plug held, but the shockwave traveled through the steel frames, snapping bolts like machine gun fire. The Thistle groaned, settling another 2 feet into the water. She was now so deep that the men on deck were standing in waist-high freezing water, clinging to the railings to avoid being swept away. Meyer, watching from the U-boat's bridge, was paralyzed by what he was seeing. In his mind, he had fired at a troopship, yet his weapon seemed to be possessed by a ghost, turning back to strike a wreck that refused to sink. The psychological impact was profound. In the high-stress environment of a submarine attack, the appearance of an unsinkable and magnetic ghost ship was enough to shatter the nerves of even the most seasoned crew. Meyer signaled the rest of the wolf pack to dive and break contact. He believed he was facing a new, experimental Allied trap ship that used electromagnetic pulses to divert torpedoes. He wasn't about to lose his boat to a phantom. As the U-boats vanished into the depths, the Empress of Indias sailed past, her lookout finally spotting the low-lying shape of the Thistle. The troopship's captain, unaware of the 4,000 lives that had just been saved by a floating scrap heap, signaled a brief message of sympathy. "Godspeed to your survivors. We'll report your position to the next escort." The Thistle was alone again, but the threat had passed. For the next 12 hours, Vane and his crew fought a battle not against the Germans, but against the ocean itself. They used hand pumps, buckets, and even their own coats to plug leaks. Chief Miller, despite his broken arm, managed to restart one of the auxiliary boilers, giving them just enough steam to keep the main pumps barely clearing the engine room. At dawn the following day, a British destroyer squadron, alerted by the Empress, arrived on the scene. They didn't find a sinking wreck. They found a concrete-armored, iron-ribbed fortress that was still stubbornly defying the Atlantic. The return to port was not the hero's welcome one might expect. When the Thistle was finally towed into the harbor at Greenock, the Admiralty officials were waiting. They saw a ship that was a grotesque violation of every naval regulation. They saw a commander who had disobeyed a direct order to scuttle his vessel. They saw a waste of 20 tons of hydraulic concrete and 84 lengths of vital railway track. Within 48 hours, Julian Vane was relieved of his command and summoned to a formal board of inquiry, a precursor to a court-martial. The official charge: willful disobedience of a standing order and the endangerment of a crew in pursuit of a vessel deemed a total loss. For months, Vane lived under the shadow of disgrace. The bureaucracy of the Royal Navy couldn't understand the worst decision he had made. They focused on the cost of the coal, the damage to the hull, and the breach of protocol. But then, the reports from the Empress of Indias began to circulate. The troopship's navigator had recorded the strange sudden explosions in the water and the way the German torpedoes had seemingly turned away from their hull. Technical divers were sent to inspect the Thistle's concrete plug, and they found the remains of the German magnetic detonators embedded in the stone. The arithmetic of the war finally caught up with the bureaucracy. The worthless trawler had saved over 4,000 men and a troopship worth millions of pounds. The worst decision was revealed to be a masterpiece of improvised warfare. The Admiralty quietly dropped the charges against Vane. There was no public medal, no parade, and no official recognition of his magnetic shield theory, partly because the Navy wanted to keep the effectiveness of the concrete and iron defense a secret for the remainder of the war. Vane was given a shore-based position in a minor naval yard, and the Thistle was eventually broken up for scrap in 1946. Her concrete heart finally separated from her iron ribs. Today, there are no monuments to the HMS Thistle. If you go to the Naval Archives, you'll find her listed merely as a repurposed trawler, damaged and later scrapped. Most history books skip over the winter of 1943 to focus on the bigger battles. But for the families of those 4,000 soldiers, the worst decision of the war was the only reason their fathers and grandfathers ever came home. Julian Vane proved that in the cold math of combat, a ship is more than just steel and steam. It is a reflection of the man on the bridge. He showed that when the technology of the era failed, A combination of defiant engineering and a refusal to follow a death sentence could rewrite the rules of survival. Innovation in war doesn't always come from a laboratory or a high-ranking general. Sometimes it comes from a man standing in freezing water, looking at a pile of railway tracks and deciding that today is not the day he is going to sink. It comes from the sergeants and the commanders who see a problem, find a solution, and don't wait for permission to be a hero. If this story of defiant engineering and the ghost ship of the North Atlantic moved you, please hit that like button. Every single like tells the algorithm that these forgotten stories of history deserve to be heard. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think. Was Vane a genius or just the luckiest man in the Navy? And don't forget to subscribe to help us keep the memory of these incredible moments alive. You're not just a viewer, you're part of the crew that ensures history isn't buried under the waves of time. Thank you for watching.